The Pope Lick Monster. First off, I want to say that I live in Kentucky and have only recently heard of this infamous beast. I also recently learned that this monster's victims have made the news before. That's right, the Pope Lick Monster has killed people in real life. Be warned, though, this monster's method of slaying may trigger some folks. Out of respect for the families of the deceased, I will use random names to maintain the integrity of the victims' identities. Allow me to start with some of the earliest encounters I could find on microfilm. In the 1960s, an old man named Jonathan was watching a construction crew work on and sketch blueprints of the Pope Lick trestle. Sources vary, but most agree that old Johnny muttered under his breath, "They shouldn't do this. The monster lives there." Again, sources vary, but most say that about 3 weeks after the bridge was constructed, the old man disappeared. Searches were conducted, and even the police got involved. In the end, all the searchers found were the mangled and bloodied remains of a severed foot. The foot looked as if it had been chopped cleanly off, like an axe was used. This reportedly spurred a short murder investigation into the situation. The police concluded that old Johnny had died, as it had been nearly a week since the discovery of the foot, and he would not have survived. However, they could never be sure it was even the old man's foot, because DNA evidence didn't exist at that time. The authorities' suspicions were likely confirmed, because in the following weeks, more cleanly cut body parts were discovered, strewn about the forest close to the trestle's construction site. The death was considered a cold case murder after further investigation, because, at that time, authorities had virtually nothing to go on except some random body parts. While the police were still trying to find the murderer, construction workers were beginning to disappear. While some were tall tales, others were documented in missing person reports. They were said to have just vanished into thin air by the workers who saw them last. Again, more remains were found in the days following the disappearances. There was no solid evidence as to who the culprit was, so the cases became stagnant. However, construction workers began seeing things, figures darting in between trees, and goat bleating that sounded a little bit off. One account from a worker says that he and his buddies were enjoying a smoke break after a long day's work, when, all of a sudden, he heard a man's scream, followed by a chopping sound. Immediately, the men stood up, shaken. The woods were silent as the grave, and they quit their job right then and there. Later, the remains of an unidentified man were found strewn about the forest, cleanly cut, as if by a blade. Those are the first couple of documented Pope Lick monster encounters that have some decent credibility. This is not some spooky story to tell friends around a campfire with s'mores. I mean, this beast had a kill count, and it still wasn't finished. Next, I will give the encounter of Betty, a teenager, who lived near the trestle. This encounter is not fantasized at all, but the name of the young lady has been changed to maintain anonymity. Betty, a 17-year-old teen from the small town of Finchville, had to drive by the trestle every day to go to her night shift at a local KFC. She would sleep late, do some homework, and then head off to her job. On a Tuesday in October, Betty was doing just that. The drive was roughly 30 minutes to the fast food joint, and she was in no rush. Like every time she went to work, Betty passed by the trestle, oblivious to the horrific history of its construction. She looked out her window to admire the way that the moon shined through the rickety steel beams. Then she noticed a shape, growing slowly in the distance. It looked like a large person was speeding at her car on all fours. The way it moved was wrong. The galloping motions the creature made were not natural. She sped up, immediately terrified of the figure. For 3 minutes, it kept pace with her car at 45 miles per hour before slowing down as she reached an area where more people were. Other drivers noticed she was going 20 over the slow 25-mile-per-hour speed limit and notified the police. They saw her speeding car and pulled her over. Upon seeing her extreme distress, the officer let her go with a warning, and she slowed down once she couldn't see the dark forest surrounding Pope Lick Road. She made it to her shift and told her co-workers that a deranged creature kept pace with her car. To her utter horror, the co-workers who took the same route as her gave their stories, describing how the creature kept pace with their car. In the early morning hours, Betty left with one of her co-workers, and they headed home, feeling secure in one another's company. That was the last time Betty and her friend, named Sammy, were seen alive. Their car was found in a ditch near the side of the road. Blood was on the dashboard, in the back seat, on the carpet padding, everywhere. There was no evidence of a collision, and no evidence of foul play, save for 2 horn-shaped indentations on the left side of her car. Exactly 2 weeks and 1 day later, the scattered remains of Betty and Sammy were found around the trestle. The cold case was then reopened, and a new set of eyes looked upon the old, dusty files. The hunt for the Pope Lick monster was resurrected. However, nothing was found on the remains, save for some goat fur, which officials brushed off as wild animals being interested in the body. Betty's co-workers would later come forward, recounting the story she told about a creature keeping pace with her car. I remember, when I was a little kid, sitting in the back of my parents' Honda Pilot, and seeing a car in a ditch with police surrounding it. This incident was no joke. I asked one of my friends to share their encounter, and they agreed. This encounter came directly from an email he sent me, after I asked him about his experience. I think it was in late December, approaching Christmas break. It was snowing a little, so I had to drive really slow, even though the speed limit was 25 km/h or something like that. I passed by the train bridge, and I saw a shape walking across the bridge. I know there have been reports of kids going out at night looking for the monster, and they dare each other to cross the bridge. But this figure looked off. Something about the way it walked just looked wrong. I wasn't in any rush, so I got out of my car and walked close to the bridge and yelled up, telling whoever was up there to get down before they hurt themselves. I hear this loud clopping sound like hooves on wood, and it sounded like there was a human-like aspect to the footfalls. One clop after the other in a rhythmic way, just like a human would walk. Then I heard the sound of goat bleating. I've heard the stories about the Pope Lick monster or the Pope Lick goat man, so I immediately walked briskly to my car and drove away. A giant furry man with massive horns began chasing my car for a long time, until I got to an area where more people were. I drove to the nearest restaurant, sat down in a booth, and quietly cried. Nothing has happened since, and I'm grateful for that. One last story. About a month ago, as of writing this, a massive, crudely made axe was found by a metal detectorist who was searching for old coins under the trestle. The axe had dried human blood on it, but there was too much decay to determine who the blood belonged to. Scientific dating methods suggested that the blood was 20 or so years old, which directly corresponds with the time that Betty and Sammy were brutally murdered. The massive axe has since disappeared on the internet. The older stories are directly from my local library's newspaper microfilm collection. The stories of an axe-wielding goat man are true, and not embellished whatsoever. Embellishing these stories in any way would not do the victims justice. Whatever lives in the woods around Pope Lick Road, it's not human.